After a long 7-year absence, Michael Myers makes his triumphant return to the Halloween franchise in the aptly titled Halloween 4: The Return of Michael Myers. Taking place 10 years after his legendary murder spree in 1978, Michael Myers, while being transferred from a federal prison back to Smith's Grove, escapes custody and heads to his hometown to pick up where he left off. Only this time, the target of his rage is his 8-year-old niece, Jamie Lloyd, daughter of his sister, the late Laurie Strode. Also back in action is Dr. Sam Loomis, now scarred and deranged from his encounter with Myers all those years ago. As chaos and murderous mayhem descend upon the small town of Haddonfield, it's up to Dr. Loomis and the newly appointed Sheriff Meeker to protect Jamie and her foster sister Rachel from Michael's unholy terror. Halloween 4: The Return of Michael Myers is the fourth installment of the Halloween franchise, as well as the first film in the series to be produced without the participation of series creator John Carpenter. Released on October 21st, 1988, the film debuted at number 1 at the box office for 2 weeks in the United States, and then went on to make over $17 million globally. The film was a direct sequel to 1981's Halloween 2 and ignored the events of Halloween 3, which would become the first of many times that the series would hit the reset button on its continuity. Following the failure of 1982's Halloween 3 to relaunch the series as a horror film anthology, the series went dormant as other slasher icons such as Freddy Krueger and Jason Voorhees took over the spotlight. Producer Mustafa Akkad still believed in the viability of the Halloween franchise and sought series creators Deborah Hill and John Carpenter to bring the iconic boogeyman back to life. The duo recruited author Dennis Etchison to pen the script for Halloween 4, with Joe Dante in mind to direct. Etchison, who had written the novelizations for Halloween 2 and 3, envisioned a more cerebral approach to the Michael Myers mythos. In this version of Halloween 4, both Dr. Loomis and Michael Myers did die in that fire explosion at the end of Halloween 2, though Myers' body was allegedly never found. Set 10 years after the events of the first 2 Halloween films, the citizens of Haddonfield, deeply traumatized by Myers' rampage, have completely banned the celebration of Halloween. Similarly to Footloose, the teenagers have resorted to celebrating outside the city limits. The film would center on Tommy Doyle and Lindsay Wallace, the 2 kids that Laurie Strode was babysitting on that fateful Halloween night. According to Etchison, the general idea around his script was the suppression of fear, and that by banning Halloween and attempting to erase Michael Myers from memory, the citizens of Haddonfield inadvertently reawakened Michael's destructive rage. Only now, Myers is no longer a living and breathing man, but the literal incarnation of evil, and hell-bent on a bloody revenge against Haddonfield. This alternative version of Halloween 4 would have been incredible to see, and ranks as one of the all-time best movies that never got made. It was the fresh take on the story that John Carpenter wanted, and would have provided plenty of blood and murder that the fans would have wanted. It would have also featured some social commentary about the horror genre and the place that horror has in our society. Plus, it wouldn't have retconned the ending of Halloween 2, which featured both Loomis and Myers graphically burning to death. It had all the makings of a triumphant return to form for the series. Too bad Mustafa Akkad flatly rejected it for all those same reasons. Akkad hated the concept apparently and stated that any Halloween film had to have Michael Myers and Dr. Loomis in the flesh and blood. This was enough for Carpenter and Hill, both of whom had no interest in this idea, to sign over their rights to the series to Akkad, which meant that Etchison's script was tossed aside as well. Dennis Etchison has talked in length since then about what his script would have entailed, and all the directions the franchise could have gone from there. For me personally though, while I would love to have seen what this Halloween 4 could have been, and to see the Halloween series go in a different direction, I also would have loved the series go in an anthology direction, and I can also see why Mustafa Akkad rejected this idea. Slasher films were the top moneymakers of the horror genre in the mid to late 80s, with Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street raking in huge grosses. Akkad was correct in thinking that audiences of the time would want to see Michael Myers as a flesh and blood killer, especially after Halloween 3 was such a bitter disappointment at the box office and had alienated audiences so much. So after gaining the full rights to the franchise, Mustafa Akkad set out to make his vision of Halloween 4 a reality. Up-and-comer Dwight H. Little was hired on as director, and screenwriter Alan McElroy was selected to pen the new script. McElroy, who would later go on to create the Wrong Turn franchise, had only 11 days to fully pitch and write the screenplay because of a looming Writers Guild strike. His script would revolve around the daughter of Laurie Strode, Jamie. Laurie Strode was killed off-screen since by this point, Jamie Lee Curtis was a big name in Hollywood and had made it vocal that she had wanted to distance herself from her Scream Queen image and the horror films that launched her career. Newcomer Danielle Harris was cast as Jamie, with franchise veteran Donald Pleasence returning as Dr. Sam Loomis. Ellie Cornell, who was also set up for the role of Kristen in Nightmare on Elm Street 4, was cast as Rachel Carruthers, Jamie's foster sister and protector. Beau Starr rounded out the cast as Ben Meeker, the new sheriff of Haddonfield, and for the role of Michael Myers, stuntman George Wilbur was selected after the previous stuntman Tom Morga was deemed a poor fit by producers. With the cast and crew in place, production officially started in the spring of 1988. To save money on filming locations, the film was shot in Salt Lake City, Utah, instead of the more expensive Pasadena, California, where the previous films had all been shot. Production was rocky at first, with several actors and crew seriously injured during the 41-day-long shoot. During a rough night shoot, Ellie Cornell sliced her stomach open on a nail during a rooftop sequence. She remained on set, however, despite the blood loss, to finish the scene before going to the hospital. Dwight Little attempted to focus much more on suspense and atmosphere, and to use little gore as the first Halloween had done. Mustafa Akkad had initially agreed with Little and requested that there be minimal gore or blood as well, though upon viewing dailies, decided that reshoots were needed to add in extra gore. John Carl Buechler, who had just completed work on Friday the 13th Part 7, The New Blood, was brought on board to film a few new shots of blood and gore effects, such as the thumb and the head kill and Michael ripping open the trucker's face in the final act. According to Danielle Harris, while filming a night sequence in the streets, cries coming from Harris alerted some neighbors unaware of the shoot, and they called the cops to report the screams. The story apparently ended up in the National Enquirer shortly afterwards and reported that Harris had been almost kidnapped off of the set. The rest of the shoot ran smoothly, and once filming had completed and reshoots were ordered, it became evident that producer Mustafa Akkad's insistence on bringing Michael Myers back to life had been the correct one. In just 1988 alone, Freddy Krueger, Jason Voorhees, Chucky, and Pinhead would all either have sequels or make their debut within months of each other. All the elements were coming together for Michael Myers' epic return to Haddonfield, and on October 21st, 1988, fans and audiences alike would finally see what Dwight Little, Alan McElroy, and his team had in store for them. The story begins with a collection of autumnal and Halloween-themed B-roll, set to Alan Howarth's moody and ambient score, both of which eventually fade into something more menacing. The music begins to swell in intensity as notes from Carpenter's iconic theme begin to seep into the music. The scene fades into a dark and stormy night, as many Halloween films do, with a lone ambulance ominously pulling up to a large and imposing sanitarium. Two medical professionals from Smith's Grove Sanitarium have come to collect Michael Myers, who has remained in a coma ever since Dr. Loomis blew them both to Kingdom Come 10 years previously. While transporting Michael back to Smith's Grove, the doctors let it slip in his presence that his only surviving relative is his 9-year-old niece Jamie Lloyd, revealing that his sister Lloyd has since passed away. This information awakens Michael Myers, who immediately repays them in kind by killing them both, as well as the two drivers in the front seat. Meanwhile, back in Haddonfield, Jamie Lloyd has been living with her foster family, the Carruthers, which also includes their daughter Rachel, played by Ellie Cornell. Cornell has become incredibly popular within the fan community, often ranking aside Jamie Lee Curtis herself as the best final girl of the series. Here she is introduced comforting Jamie, who has been having trouble falling asleep the closer that it gets to Halloween. Outside in the storm, she has a vision of the ambulance, which at first glance may seem odd and out of place, but when taking into account the sequels that come later, it appears to set up certain plot elements that would become the focal point of Halloween 5 and by association Halloween 6. Though unlike those movies, here it's rather subtle and just another trick that Little uses to build tension, as well as to firmly establish the connection between Jamie and Michael with the audience. Later on, as Jamie is saying her nightly prayers, she is attacked again by the visage of Michael Myers before it is revealed to be a dream, though one has to wonder who told her about Michael and what he looked like. Seriously, yo, that's fucked up. The next morning, we're treated to some typical teenage angst that will be instantly familiar to anyone who watched 80s sitcoms. Rachel is understandably bummed out that she has to babysit Jamie, even though she had plans with her boyfriend Brady, but she promises to make it up to her after Jamie overhears her voicing her discomfort in one of the many touching scenes between the two actresses. Danielle Harris is often commended for her acting abilities as a child actress, who oftentimes have a reputation for being an annoyance throughout any given film. Harris's work here in the Halloween franchise was the foundation of her long and impactful career, and she has never forgotten her role in the series or the fans that made her a star. And I can tell you, having watched this film for the first time as a young child, having a younger star in the leading role made all the difference, and is one of the many reasons that this film has stuck with me and many other fans for all throughout the decades. Meanwhile, back at Ridgemont, Dr. Loomis is tearing the staff a new one for letting Michael Myers out on the eve of Halloween, and sure enough, the staff gets the call that Loomis had been expecting, which sends Loomis into a frenzy. The grisly carnage at the crime scene tells Loomis everything he needs to know, and he makes a beeline for Haddonfield to try and warn them before it's too late. Michael, 5 steps ahead of Loomis as always, makes his way to a gas station where he finds some slick new threads and waits patiently for Loomis to catch up. For some reason. What follows is a memorable and intense standoff between the two, as Loomis discovers the bodies that he's left in his wake and sees Michael again for the first time face to face in almost 10 years. Michael predictably gets away, but not before destroying Loomis's only means of transportation, forcing him to continue his journey on foot. While making his way back to Haddonfield, he gets a ride from a fellow doomsday sayer, and we get one of the few lighthearted moments in the franchise from Loomis as he partakes in a drink and a song with his new best friend. Seriously, I know this seems really weird, but I really loved this scene. It always stuck out to me as a kid, and I think it's one of the few genuine moments that harkens back to the Carpenter feel of the original without actually copying it. Back in Haddonfield, Jamie has had second thoughts about going trick-or-treating, and so Rachel and her friend Lindsay, who is apparently supposed to be the same Lindsay Wallace from the original Halloween, take her to the discount store where Brady works, giving Rachel a chance to break the news. The original script featured Lindsay more heavily, and Tommy Doyle apparently also makes a brief appearance as one of Brady's friends in the discount store. I can only assume both roles were drastically cut down due to budget constraints, but still, their inclusion is cool for Halloween superfans such as myself. While Jamie tries on costumes, Brady takes Rachel's news about as well as a horny teenage boy would, a fact that the nearby and envious Kelly Meeker, daughter of the new sheriff Ben Meeker, is all too willing to take advantage of. While this teenage soap opera continues to play out, Jamie finds the perfect costume in the form of a red and white clown outfit, though longtime Halloween fans might notice that it looks awfully familiar to Michael's own clown outfit from when he was a child. Jamie must also subconsciously know this as we're treated to another hallucination, this time of a young Michael Myers wearing the same outfit. This freaks Jamie out, but not before the real Michael Myers makes himself known to Jamie and the audience for the first time in his new mask. This mask has become infamous within the fan community, and it's not without merit. The mask does look like a cheap dime store knockoff, something that you'd see someone wearing as an actual Halloween costume, not the prop of a multi-million-dollar film production. A mask made for a movie 10 years after the first one, with many more times the budget, should not look cheaper and uglier, though maybe this was the look the film producers were going for. There has been talk about how the first batch of masks had been delivered completely unaltered, and so the film's makeup team had to hastily redesign each mask before shooting began. Evidently, some unaltered masks made it onto the set for certain scenes, as evident in the infamous school hallway scene, in which Michael appears behind Dr. Loomis in a pink and blonde-haired mask. I know it was the 80s, but come on, producers, how was this allowed into the final product? Anywho, Michael doesn't attack Jamie just yet, allowing her to feel safe in the arms of her protectors. For now. Jamie and Rachel make their way through town, and Jamie even decides, bizarrely, to join the bullies that had just teased her like tiny little psychopaths for being related to Michael. Honestly, this is just some contrived way for Rachel and Jamie to get separated, as she spots Brady in the home of Kelly Meeker and runs off in a jealous rage. By this time, Dr. Loomis has finally made his way back to Haddonfield, and thankfully his pleas of evil has returned are not going unignored by the new sheriff, who immediately takes Loomis at his word. The two begin their search for Jamie as Michael slowly begins to sow chaos and murderous mayhem all throughout the Midwestern town. First, by taking out the town's power by killing station worker Bucky and throwing him into a generator. News of the sheriff's curfew begins to reach the locals, but the town's population of rednecks and barflies aren't about to let their Halloween festivities end without a fight. Sheriff Meeker and Dr. Loomis manage to locate both Jamie and Rachel, who survived a brief encounter with Myers in a dark alleyway, though Michael is not far behind. At the police station, the duo only finds a slaughterhouse, as Michael apparently killed off the entire police force off-screen. What the actual fuck, Mustafa Akkad? What gives? I wanted to see that shit. You did the same thing in Halloween 5 too. You claim to love the Halloween franchise and the fans, but your actions as a producer call this into question. Anywho, the rowdy group of rednecks makes their way to the police station in search of answers, where Dr. Loomis informs them of Myers' return. With the pain of Michael's rampage from 10 years prior still fresh in the minds of many, the newly formed lynch mob decides to take matters into their own hands, and Sheriff Meeker can only watch helplessly as chaos begins to descend upon his once peaceful town. Despite their attempts to lure John Carpenter and Deborah Hill back into the franchise, both had washed their hands clean of the series, though they did allow for use of their characters, and more importantly in John Carpenter's case, use for his music in each subsequent sequel. Alan Howarth, who composed the scores for Halloween 2 and 3 alongside John Carpenter, returned this time solo and provided some new themes of his own alongside Carpenter's classic motifs. The music for Halloween 4 is a standout amongst the sequels and recalls the best of Carpenter's work as showcasing Howarth's talent in reinterpreting the iconic Halloween theme. Jamie's Nightmare is probably the standout of the new tracks, as well as the opening theme, which mixes in some scary ambient music and soundscapes with the classic Halloween theme. The Myers chase theme is also pretty intense, and the soundtrack as a whole is a pretty compelling listen even without the movie to accompany it, and I think it sits high within the discography of Howarth and John Carpenter. The release of the film was highly anticipated by fans of the original and slasher films in general. The late 80s were a very mixed bag for the horror genre, as sequels to established franchises made up the bulk of the titles released during this time. The Halloween franchise had also been dormant for over 6 years, with Michael himself not having been on the big screen since 1981. A lot of things had changed in horror in just that 7-year span of time, so there must have been at least some speculation from the producers that the film might not perform as well once released. Any fears that they may have had, though, must have been vanquished when those box office numbers came in for October 21st. Halloween 4, while no blockbuster, debuted at number 1 for 2 weeks and was considered a success by the studio following the failure of Halloween 3. The final box office intake for Halloween 4 would stand at around $17 million domestically, which, while above Halloween 3, did come in below the tallies for A Child's Play, Nightmare on Elm Street 4, and Friday the 13th Part 7. Critically, the reviews were overly negative, as they usually were with slasher films, with critics poking holes in the story, lamenting the lack of originality, and calling it a cheap imitation of Carpenter's immortal classic. And I'll be completely honest, there is absolutely merit to all of those critiques. Even though it was made with over 10 times the budget, certain choices, as well as the decision to film in an entirely different format, keep the film from achieving the same level of atmosphere and simplistic elegance that made the 1978 film such a classic. In addition, some reviewers singled out the teen characters as lacking the nuance and friendship of the original characters, and the abundance of errors such as the aforementioned Myers mask scene definitely stand out and can ruin the experience at times. But people seem to forget that those same errors can be found sprinkled all throughout the original Halloween, and critics were also dismissive of the original Halloween at first, and in the years since, just like that original 1978 classic, Halloween 4 has developed a strong cult following, driven by annual reruns during the Halloween season and the overall popularity of the franchise, which seems to surge more and more each year. Many fans and critics single out Halloween 4 as one of the better sequels, not only of the franchise, but of slasher sequels in general. Its rich atmosphere, music, and compelling lead performances have all been praised, and it often ranks within the top 5 of the series. It's definitely regarded as the best of the so-called Thorn trilogy, and is one of the purest and most faithful follow-ups to the 1978 film. Its cosmetic flaws are outweighed by the love and reverence that the crew had here for the original film. And of all the sequels to choose from for my annual rewatches, it definitely makes the cut more times than not. The final act begins with our main players all converging at the Meeker residence, where they hilariously and awkwardly interrupt Brady and Kelly's sex scene, though Ben makes it well known that he's no fool when it comes to their sexcapades.
Well, yeah, I catch you broke my daughter. I use that shotgun on you. You understand?
Sheriff Meeker calls in for reinforcements while Dr. Loomis takes to the streets in a vain attempt to find Michael on his own. Though what Loomis and everyone else doesn't know, and what we the audience know, is that Michael is already there at the Meeker house, and the sheriff has inadvertently locked himself in with the madman. And once the sheriff leaves to round up the lynch mob that has already claimed the life of an innocent man, Michael finally emerges from the shadows, first dispatching the last remaining deputy, before impaling Kelly on the wall with a shotgun. Brady makes a bold attempt to take Michael on one-on-one, which ends with, predictably, grisly results. With Rachel and Jamie the only ones left, they manage to evade Myers by climbing up to the roof in a series of well-executed and suspenseful chase scenes, though Myers finally gets the better of Rachel, sending her plummeting to the ground below, while Jamie makes it down safely thanks to her big sister. Dr. Loomis shows up in the nick of time, and the two make their way to Jamie's school in what I can only assume is a subtle callback to the original and Halloween 2. However, Loomis is quickly ambushed by Myers, leaving Jamie all alone yet again. Rachel, though, having recovered like the badass that she is, knocks Myers out with a fire hydrant and takes Jamie into the waiting arms of the lynched mob, who decide to leave Myers for the arriving state police. The group then rides off into the night, leaving Haddonfield and the carnage behind them. Just take a guess what happens next. That's right, Myers is obviously still alive and takes out the remaining mob members with his mystical teleporting powers, leaving Rachel and Jamie alone with the masked psycho once more. What results is probably one of the single best and most suspenseful final chase scenes in the entire franchise. Rachel takes on the driver's seat and successfully repels Michael long enough to get him off of the car before sending him into an abandoned mining field. The state police finally arrive alongside Sheriff Meeker, while young Jamie goes to check on her evil uncle, going as so far as to touch his hand for a brief moment. Myers, who is of course still alive, rises to strike down his young niece, but Meeker and the rest of the state police righteously blow Michael to kingdom come, sending him backwards into a mine shaft that quickly collapses on top of him. Back at the Carruthers' house, Jamie and Rachel are reunited with their parents, and Dr. Loomis is revealed to still be alive, because what would the franchise, especially this late in the game, do without him? Darlene, Rachel's mother, takes a strangely blank and vacant Jamie upstairs for a bath, while Loomis assures Rachel and her father that they will overcome this tragedy. Upstairs, an unknown figure dons a mask, a pair of scissors, then creeps into the bathroom where Darlene is preparing Jamie's bath. A horrifying scream pierces the house as Loomis frantically runs to check, gun drawn, and ready to blow Michael away yet again. But what he sees atop the stairs is a sight much more horrifying. It's not Michael, it's Jamie, covered in her mother's blood and holding a pair of bloody scissors, an almost mirror image of her evil uncle's first murder. Loomis, having his worst fear realized, goes to shoot Jamie, but is stopped by Meeker and the rest of the family. But they can only look on in horror as Jamie raises the scissors once again, ready to take on the mantle as the new shape of Haddonfield. I can remember the very first time I watched Halloween 4 like it happened yesterday. I was 8 years old, roughly about the same age as young Jamie is in the movie, and my parents had just finished watching some Western on AMC. They had begun moving outside to prepare for family and friends that were coming over for some unknown reason. I wasn't too keen on movies outside of Pokemon or Disney Channel original movies, and certainly had no taste for horror outside maybe the original Jaws, which I had also seen with my parents. So when this eerie and scary movie started playing on screen, it was something that immediately caught my attention. As the movie progressed, I became mesmerized, and I settled in for the first true horror movie experience of my life. The time went by so fast that before I knew it, the movie was already over and I was left in awe and in fear. That iconic music was playing over and over again in my head, and the ghostly images of Michael gliding through the dark and foggy streets of Haddonfield were trapped in replay. I remember running out to my parents and shouting at the heavens at how awesome the movie was, much to the real horror of everyone there. It wasn't so awesome for me though later that night when I tried to go to bed, with that music and mask still deeply ingrained in my head. A seedling, though, had been laid that night. I was still too young to really understand or form opinions on movies, but just a few short years later, once I had a computer of my own, I began researching horror movies, and I never forgot Michael Myers and his nightmarish pursuit of Jamie Lloyd, and quickly found out that the movie that I'd watched was actually a sequel, and there was a long line of Halloween films waiting for me to watch. Do AMC's classic Fear Friday and Monster Fest horror marathons, with my parents reluctantly renting the remaining ones for me. Halloween, Michael Myers, and John Carpenter were instrumental in developing my love for not only the horror genre, but my appreciation for the art of cinema as a whole. It really bugs me when I often see critics dismiss slashers, horror, and especially sequels, as trashy, exploitative cash grabs, and fail to see the art and painstaking hard work that goes into making these kinds of films, as well as dismissing the passionate fan bases behind them as crazed lunatics obsessed with murder and death. The horror and slasher fan communities have been well known for being some of the least problematic and most welcoming of fan bases, which is completely at odds with the subject matter. Going back to Danielle Harris for a second, it's been well reported that Harris had a stalker in the mid to late 90s, and many, including myself, assume that it stemmed from her work in the Halloween franchise. As it turns out, it actually stemmed from her reoccurring character from the hit sitcom Roseanne, in which she played a rebellious teenager that stood in heavy contrast to the innocent and timid Jamie Lloyd. I just think it's funny how this show, a considerably more lighthearted and comedic series, would spawn this kind of behavior when the media would have you believe it should be the other way around. It's just another example of how critics don't understand horror films or fans and continually mischaracterize them as mentally unstable. I'm not saying that there aren't problematic fans, because there certainly are, but it's always been frustrating dealing with the stigma of being a horror fanatic and having to assure people that I'm not a crazed serial killer as well.
Jesus ain't got nothing to do with this place. Come on.
Halloween 4: The Return of Michael Myers is far from a perfect film, and if I'm being completely honest, it's only half, maybe 60%, and that's being generous, of the film that the original 1978 is. Though to be fair, you could say that about just every Halloween sequel. The original film is lightning in a bottle, and all the ideas and story that Carpenter and Hill had in mind for Halloween are in that first film. Every sequel outside of 3 is forever trapped in its shadow, feeling the need to constantly reference certain scenes or dialogue, never allowing themselves to truly be their own movie. And Halloween 4 is no different. It's an almost elemental slasher sequel, following the formula of the original Halloween very closely, often riding the line between sequel and remake. Dwight H. Little and Ellie McElroy, though, have more than a few tricks up their sleeves that keep this from being simply another rehash. For one, there's the added focus on the teenage characters. While not the most engaging or well written, it's performed pretty well by all the players here, and their interactions and dialogue are leagues above the sequels that would come later. Danielle Harris, as previously mentioned, gives a star-making performance here, and her role as Jamie Lloyd remains her most popular and well-known to date, so much so that the retconning of her character in Halloween H2O was met with harsh backlash from many fans. Dr. Loomis is great as always, though as the sequels progress, Pleasence begins to play the character a bit more chaotically, though given what Loomis has been put through, it's not hard to see why. Even the smaller characters, such as the guard from Richmond and the aforementioned priest, they all make an impression and give the movie some color and character that is severely lacking in the later sequels. The film's flaws, as small as they are unfortunately more noticeable than others. There are just a sheer amount of continuity errors and goofs, such as Loomis's changing makeup, the mask switch up, and towards the end of the film, the audio actually becomes unsynced for like maybe a second or so, but it's still noticeable and it just takes me out of the moment. These kinds of goofs and continuity errors were common in 80s slasher films, which were seen by studios and producers more or less as cows that just needed to be milked. The Accounts, however, held a deep respect for Carpenter's original vision and believed passionately in the franchise, and this love does seep into even the worst Halloween films. And you can tell here in Halloween 4 that extra care was put into recreating as much of the Carpenter atmosphere as possible, and for the most part, they succeeded. They may not have gotten the mask right, and perhaps a less rushed and more focused shoot would have smoothed out all of the bumps in the story. But if you ask me, they got pretty much everything else right about the movie. The story, characters, mood, music, it's all first rate when compared to other films of its ilk. Slasher sequels aren't exactly known for their production values or attention to detail, but Halloween 4 gives both more consideration than it needed to. That producers could have just pumped out sequel after sequel like the Friday the 13th series, but they didn't. They took their time, they decided on what the best direction for the series was, and then they assembled the best crew of people that they could to make it happen. Halloween 4 remains a pivotal film in the series, as it proved that there was still plenty of gas left in the tank for the Halloween franchise, and that audiences were still thirsty for more of Michael's murderous mayhem. The direction the series went in going forward may have been less than desirable, as future sequels would essentially ignore the film's bold and daring cliffhanger ending in favor of bringing Myers back yet again, but as it stands, Halloween 4 remains one of the better attempts at bringing Michael Myers back after a long absence. Its success at the box office and popularity with fans ensured that the Halloween franchise would go on for the next decade, and opened up another branch of the Halloween timeline that, while controversial, remains popular with the fanbase and has been incredibly inspirational in comics, fanworks, and within future sequels as well. Had it not been for Mustafa Akkad's push to bring Michael Myers back, we may not have seen the return of the shape for a long time. Akkad didn't always have the best ideas, but he did seem to have the best of intentions, outside of making money, of course. He valued the name and the brand of Halloween, and better yet, he respected the genius of what John Carpenter and Deborah Hill created, and did his best to keep that spirit alive throughout his tenure with the Halloween franchise. Halloween 4 is probably the best of the sequels that were made without the participation of Carpenter and Hill, but because of Akkad, along with Dwight and his crew, you can barely even tell that they're missing. This Halloween has everything that you want in a Halloween film. It's got atmosphere, an imposing and stealthy Michael, endearing characters, and of course, Donald Pleasence's Dr. Loomis, now more crazed and determined to end Myers than ever. And not to sound elitist, whatever the hell that means, but I've always felt that there was a level of class and sophistication to the Halloween series, even in the lesser and more problematic films. Every film, as trapped in the shadow of Carpenter's classic as they are, tries to replicate its formula for success, often with meddling results. Halloween 4, The Return of Michael Myers, though, proved that you could have your cake and eat it too. With just enough fresh meat to enliven this once mighty franchise, Halloween 4 recreates John Carpenter and Deborah Hill's seminal masterpiece as best it can, showcasing both Ellie Cornell and Danielle Harris in career-defining roles, and giving audiences of the 80s the Halloween film that they'd always been waiting for. Thank you as always for joining me tonight. For those of you who made it all the way to the end, you'll never know how much that means to me. This video has been a video that I've been wanting to make since I started my channel, and at one point it was intended to be the very first video that I posted. It took far too long for me to get here, but it's finally done now. Please let me know in the comments what you thought, as well as your first memory of watching Halloween 4 or any other Halloween film. I know it may seem silly being this passionate about such a nothing movie. It's so much more than a slasher film to me, though. It may just be the nostalgia goggles, but I think critics are just wrong about Halloween 4. It's always been a classic of the genre in my house, and as far as slasher sequels go, Halloween 4 remains a cut above the rest.
Michael Myers is coming to AMC.
Sorry about your ears, CJ. What do you want, Carson? I'm trying to record. Quit, shut the fuck up. Like, for real. What do you want? I got you food and you got water. You'd be fine for an hour until I finish this.